All right, so this file that I've got open here is it's in the gteam folder. If you want it, it's called 04 final, I think. Also in the gteam folder, there's a bunch of other files that basically step through the process that we're going to do this morning. So if you ever get lost at some point, you just raise your hand and say, which one can I open up to get to where we're at? There's about 4 different stages along the way that are good sort of jumping on points if you get out of step with what we're doing. Again, you don't need those files for the most part, but they can be helpful if you get a little lost on the way. So I'm just going to dissect this guy a little bit to show you where we're headed. First thing, if you are looking at this file, you'll notice that there's, you can do things like if you draw a form element, nothing shows up. That's because, I don't know how many of you guys have looked at this part of Vasari and Revit, but there's a lot of visibility controls, which I always just get through doing VG. But, geez, how do we actually get it to the user interface? It's visibility graphics. Visibility graphics for Rhino and AutoCAD people, the closest thing that this is equivalent to is layers. And it's just a way to sort of manipulate what you're seeing in the view. So this file just happens to have form turned off. So all form elements that are of mass category are going to get turned off. You can see I turned that back on and the thing that I was drawing over here shows up. But, and there's other stuff that shows up here. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But just to sort of show you how there's a whole other world of how to control visibility and graphics in your views, and there's lots of stuff that's written on it. We're just going to run into it today as sort of part of how we're going to make some of these models more intelligible. So then within that, what I've got is I've got a divided surface, or actually I have 2 divided surfaces, one here and one here, and I have components that are threaded between those 2 surfaces. But then one other sort of salient feature of this is that you can see that this curved surface here is not being divided by its sort of natural UV coordinate system. Rather, it's being chopped up by these layers, by these levels right here. And then so that you can have a nice sort of clean horizontal connection between this divided surface and this divided surface. Anyway, we're going to get into this. We're going to be able to make this from scratch. And in order to do that, we're going to start a new file. And we're going to make a new mass. So go ahead and do that. If you go to V, New Family. And for those who are in Vasari, you're going to see this. For those who are in Revit, you're going to see the conceptual mass folder, and you can go in and get the mass RST. Who's working in Vasari? Who's working in Revit? Okay. Again, shouldn't really matter. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a general form. And the idea with this form is going to be vaguely that we're making something like a double skin facade, something where you've got an interior skin that does something on the building and an exterior skin, and they may not necessarily be the same thing. So we're just going to quickly make some form here. And I've got my model line. And there's another file that we can also download to sort of get to this stage, but there's a couple of tricks of form making that I think is also useful to show you guys along the way. So I've just got a line and I'm creating a form from it. This should be not any kind of new thing for anybody yet. And then if you go and look at it up top, what we're going to do is we're going to make a copy of this guy. Yep. Look. Yeah, I just drew a line and then I created form from it, so that you just have a plane like that. And then once you've got that, we're going to copy it over so that we now have 2 surfaces. Like that. They don't need to be in any particular relationship to each other, you just need to have 2 of these guys.
Why did you just click them?
Sure. I'll just show this again. So I've got my line tool. Make sure that your placement plane is picked for level 1, because sometimes you can end up not being on there. So I've got my line, drawing it really any old place, selecting it, creating form. And if you select that top edge, that's what you're asking about? Then you can just pull it up.
If I'm create form, you have to select it first.
Yeah. So we got that. And what we're just doing here is we're roughing out, our interior and our exterior wall. So I've just got it copied right now, and I'm going to go copy, drag, like that. And that all could be fine. I'm just hitting HL here to get into hidden line mode so you can see it a little bit easier up there. This is boring, so we're not going to leave it this way. And I also want to show you a couple of other tools for form creation. So if you select this front or exterior wall, let's call it, and you look up here in the form element tools, you've got a bunch of other tools. When you select add profile, and what add profile allows you to do is create a little bit more definition and a little bit more control over this form element. So I'm just going to pick that right there. It doesn't look like it's changed anything, but when I hover over, you can see that you can now select that edge and you can pull it out, thereby making slightly more exciting form. Annoying when you're dealing with just surfaces in this application. It's possible to go in and just select it, and it looks like you've selected the whole thing, but what you've in fact selected is just the surface, which is sort of silly because it's just a surface, but it's not the whole thing. So when you select the element, you can do things like copy and drag. But when you just select the face, no such luck. So that's actually, I'm glad that you brought that up, because you can either deal with that by, if you look down here in the lower left, the status bar, you can see that right now I'd just be selecting the surface, which would not allow me to copy. If I tab, I can get the element, or if I box select, I'll get the whole element. So anyway, long way around to get to two surfaces, and the other things that you can see with this is, and we saw this already when we were dragging up this edge, is that you can pull around these faces. You can do other things with them like that. But basically I just want to have like one flat surface, I want to have one curved surface. You can also get it in here at the points if you wanted to, where you can manipulate these guys like that, and get into more goofy shapes. Anyway.
How did you curve these surface?
Okay, so then after if you've got a flat surface, you go add profile,
Okay.
and then that allows you to add another control line.
Okay.
And then after you do that, you should be able to select that control line and drag it out like that. How many people don't have this kind of shape yet? Still working on it? A couple people? All right. People who have it and people who are getting there, let's save this as, I'm just going to call this base form. You can call it Jehoshaphat, doesn't really matter, but you need to give it something that you can recognize. And so what we're going to do is, how many people here have actually gotten into the stage where they've made stuff in Revit and they try and make a manipulation and then they sit and they wait and they wait and they wait and they wait? Has anybody gotten that point, watching the little hourglass go? Basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to set up a larger building form that's going to be separate from components that you're going to add to it. And what this is going to allow us to do is that you can do larger building manipulations and not worry about performance of having all of your systems catch up to it. So right now we've got a building form, right? So we're going to make a new mass family, and we're going to bring this guy into it. So we've got a new mass. Ta-da! And let's save this one and call it something. Let's call it host family. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that other form that we made into it so we can start doing other manipulations on it. So I just Control-Tab to get back over to here. Now I'm going to load base form into host family, right? And you can put it any old place. When I do this sort of operation, I like to put it right at the dead center just because then I know exactly where it is in relationship to the other file. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this exercise. How many people is this a new activity to do, like load one family into another family? Probably actually shouldn't be because we covered this in the last class. But what we're doing here is we're loading one mass into another mass rather than loading a curtain panel into a mass or loading anything else into another family. This is a mass into a mass. And so what you can do is that I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to make some manipulation to it. I'm going to take my form and I'm going to, I'll take this guy and I'll make it more bowed, right? And I can load it into the project and overwrite the existing thing and just see it update. Now it seems like that's a really sort of simple, dumb kind of operation, but the efficiency that it allows you is that now you've got isolation. You've got one file that's dealing with your building form and one file that is you're going to be able to do other operations on it. So if we're back in our host file, what I want to do is I want to start dividing this up so that I can actually add components to it. So even though that this is a loaded family and it's not a form that's right here in the project itself, see if I hover over it, it says base form. It's not telling me element or anything else. If I tab, you can see that I can tab into its faces. I can even tab into its edges and other parts of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tab in and select the face of one of these guys, and I'm going to divide it. And I'm going to tab into the other face, and I'm going to divide it. So right off, this looks a little bit different than if you just did this right in the project. So here, I'm just going to show you quick. You don't need to do this. But if I had a surface in the project and I divided it, you know, the surfaceness of it is sort of subsumed within the divide. That's not so with this loaded family, because the loaded family persists and you've got this overlay on top of it. So you can sort of be more explicit about what is your hosting relationship and what is your hosted element. So right now I've got a divided surface that's hosted on a nested family, right? Now what I want to do is I want to start patterning this with things that are going to make connections between my interior envelope and my exterior envelope. Just to sort of stay with our sort of case study here of something that you might actually do with a building. But you know how before we did this with curtain panels? What I want to do is I want to create slightly more complex relationships than we did before, where we were taking a surface and we were just patterning it with stuff, right? Now what I want to do is I want to create a relationship that spans between these two surfaces. There's a couple of projects that are specifically going to need this, and then there's a couple, and then most other projects will probably benefit from this, but there's certainly pieces along the way that everybody's going to need to know. Particularly things like the Cooper Union project has a lot of stuff about relationships between interior and exterior. The Shanghai Tower also has that relationship where you've got a core element and you've got an exterior envelope, and they're going to need to have some sort of repeated relationship that happens between them. So in order to do that, we're going to make a component that's going to have that kind of relationship. So we're going to go new family, and we're going to make an adaptive component. And did we make adaptive components last time we talked? I don't think we did. I think we just did curtain panels, right? Adaptive components are very much like curtain panels, but they're a little bit more open-ended. So what we're going to do is we're going to just create a fairly simple sort of line drawing adaptive component, and we're just going to explore the sort of things that you can do with it. So everybody have an adaptive component open? Yes? All right. Let's save it now before I forget to have it saved, and we're going to call this 4-point family. And the reason it's going to be 4 point is it's going to have 4 placement points. So if we go up to model line, click 3D snapping. Now remember, 3D snapping is what allows you to create points on the fly as you're drawing geometry. And we're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing too special here. And after we've got your basic points, what I want to do is I want to designate these points as being special and being sort of part of how this form is going to get placed. So if you select everything, you can go over here into the drop down and just identify your reference points. You can also do the same thing actually by going into the filter and just having your reference points selected. And what I want to do is in the properties for these points, the properties is where all the magic happens for most things. If you go over here into the adaptive component portion of properties, you'll see that there's a drop down here that's reference point, placement point, and shape handle point. Today we're just going to deal with placement point. I don't think we're going to have time to get into shape handles, but we can talk about it if you want. We're going to make these guys placement points. And after you do that, you'll see that it gets numbered. Now what this numbering scheme is indicates, basically I'm going to take this family, I'm going to load it in, and rather than just placing one point to place it, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 to allow me to place this skeleton in any particular way that I want. And as with any loaded family, we're just going to start off very simple with lines, but this can just be the skeleton for building up any kind of complexity that you want. But this basically can become a proxy for later work. Also for a lot of the work that Dennis has been talking about for making sort of schematic and diagrammatic relationships where you're just doing things like center lines of beams. A lot of the times this is actually all the geometry that you need. So we're going to take our 4-point family and we're going to load this into host family. And you should have the little guy here on your tooltip, right? And you can just place it around, you can do whatever with it. Let's actually make a couple of these guys, and I want to just show you a couple of other features of this thing. Remember how when we loaded in this mass, we were able to make a divided surface that is hosted on top of it? If you select this guy, you'll see the numbers show up. You can go hit create form. So it's not that this is just a loaded family, but this is also something that can be a referent for making other stuff, right? And there's a lot of other features that you can work out of this. So if I go back in here for a second, select the model line and delete it. And let's just make something curvy and wacky where we just select all the points and hit spline by points. I'm going to go back and I'll do this again, but just to sort of show you where this is headed. If I take this and I load it into the project now, and I overwrite the existing one, you're going to see this guy update and change to whatever the geometry was in the loaded family. The thing that's cool about this is that you can start laying out geometry and you can start laying out relationships and building things on top of it before you really know exactly what you want the thing to be. So I'm just going to undo this quick. There's a couple of caveats about what does and what does not work with this sort of thing. If I had a form, if I had a loaded family that it didn't make sense to select everything in it and make a form from it, it would fail when I did this. Like if I had a bunch of intersecting lines that wouldn't make sense for creating a form element, it won't be able to do that. Anyway, people now have a loaded family into this, have something vaguely like this, right? Yo.
I'm having trouble getting the points to separate from the line.
Sure. The reference points?
You can show the reference points.
Sure, sure. So are you having lines that don't stay put associated with these
Well,
lines?
I made the line, but now I'm trying to extract the points that we do. So
Okay. Here, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to make it again from scratch and see what happened along the way. So the way that I built this thing up from zero was I did model line. And you got to make sure that 3D snapping is checked, because that allows you to actually create a fundamentally different kind of line, which is the line is depending on those points. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm done, then I have these points. And then for the creation of the adaptive points from these points, what I was doing is I was selecting everything, and then I was picking reference points from the drop-down. You can also go and you can individually select them. It's just slower, where you get each point, and then you can go to the drop-down and identify them as adaptive points. You can also actually go into the ribbon. I always forget that this is here, but you can hit Make Adaptive right up here in the ribbon. It all gets you to the same place where you've got points that are connected by lines. So does that get you where you need to be?
yeah, I had just drawn lines on the model line.
Okay. So, oops. So now, if we're back in this guy, the thing that I want to start doing is I want to start creating relationships between my exterior surface and my interior surface. And if you recall, we had looked very briefly before at the surface representation for divided surfaces before. What these guys can do is these guys can host themselves on the points of these surfaces, but unfortunately, right out of the box, they cannot, because you need to turn on one more aspect of the divided surface in order to access all sorts of goodies about it. So if you select one of the surfaces, I want you to go up to surface representation. And if you go to the little arrow thingy, you'll see that in surface representation you can turn on nodes. And nodes are essentially the sort of secret magic sauce for snapping these components to this form. So turn on nodes, and we're also going to do that over here. We're going to turn on nodes. Like that. And it's starting to get a little crowded in here, and it's harder for me to see stuff. So I want to just show you again how to sort of control some of the visibility of elements in your project. So if you go to Manage and go to Visibility Graphics, this is also VG. I go in and out of it all the time, so it's good to sort of know some of these shortcuts for stuff that you do more often than others. And I'm going to open up the mask dropdown, and I'm going to turn off form visibility. So basically, this is just going to identify anything that's a form element that's in this project that has been made in a mask family is now not going to be visible. That includes my nested families. So if I go OK, so now I've just got the stuff I want to look at, right? So I want to start defining a relationship between my exterior envelope and my interior envelope. So if you go into your families file, families part of your project browser, you can see you've got your base form, and you've also got generic model, which is what the adaptive component is. Adaptive component is category generic model. And you've got your 4-point family. Now what I want to do is I want to pull out this 4-point family, and I want to start building this relationship between these two. Because we turned on our node points, and this is the thing, I'm sure that sometime this week if somebody tries to go and access this, they're going to say, all right, I made my component and I'm trying to put it on my divided surface and it won't stay put. And it's probably going to be because you forgot to turn on node visibility. It's just like one of those gotchas that always gets people. So node visibility, you need that. 4-point family, if you drag it out, you now have it on your tooltip. Now you'll notice that it snaps to these node points. Another little gotcha is that if you've been messing around with setting work planes and such, sometimes the placement plane will turn on to place on work plane instead of place on face. There's another gotcha that if you're on place on work plane, you're not going to get this nice snapping behavior. It needs to be place on face. I have no good explanation for why that is, but it is. So as long as you're on place on face, you've got your component here. What we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I want to have this thing sewing to these 3 points and this guy. Let's say that we're making some kind of framework that is hosted on your nice orthogonal building geometry core and is creating some sort of standoff that's supporting your curvy, wavy, expensive facade. And we're just going to start establishing that relationship. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to have this relationship, right? Well, if you were, hey, how's it going? If you were all masochists, you could say, okay, well now I know how to do that, and I can do it over and over and over again for all of my surfaces here. But I am remarkably lazy, and I'm not a masochist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick with this one relationship that I've had created here. And there's a very subtle tool up here. It's called repeat. And when you select this adaptive component, you'll see that it becomes active. So right now it's not active because I don't have anything selected. If you select your adaptive component, you'll see that it is. And if you hit repeat, it's just going to populate your entire surface with a connection that you have created between this surface and this surface. So everybody should go ahead and just sort of see the magic of it populating the surface. And you can take a look at it here on the side. If you tab select to the divided surface over here and then hold control, and you can, so basically what I'm doing is I'm just selecting both divided surfaces. This is, a fully parametric relationship here still, so you can go change the divided surface to be a different resolution. Go ahead and let's change that to 6 and just sort of see how it's just going to simplify the relationship down. You can increase and decrease the resolution. For folks who are coming in late, there's files up on GTeam if you want to download to sort of jump in and get farther in along here. You also are in, so if people have, let me just show this again. Up on GTeam, there's a folder called Tutorials and Documents, and then with today's date, the 15th, you can download these files, which will catch you up with different stages of the project if you want to jump in. Right now, we've gotten to O2 repeater. That's about where we're at right now. So, does everybody have a surface that looks vaguely like this? Yeah.
I missed this last part. No, it's less.
How you got it to be less? Okay. There's a bunch of elements now that are actually that are possible to select, and so it can get a little bit tricky actually grabbing the right thing. So right here, I've selected a repeater, which is like it becomes its own thing. You've got your divided surface, you've got your loaded family, you've got your repeater, and those are all different things. So if you go in and you select the divided surface, and here I'm going to need to tab to select the other one and hold control, then I'll have access to both of the divided surfaces at the same time, so I can control the resolution. And you can start doing goofy things like, rotating them, but let's not do that just yet.
Just change 6 to 6.
Yeah, let's just change from 12 to 6 for now. So the other thing is, ooh, there's like some motorcade out there. Look at all the pretty lights. One feature of this that I'm just selecting my repeater and I'm hitting the right side of the view cube, is that you've got a divided surface out here on the curvy-wurvy part and on the straight part, and while they are both dividing by 6, they are not dividing in such a way that they actually line up, right? This is dividing into 6, but it's a longer surface because it's a curve, and it's just connecting the dots, right? So in most real-world applications, you want something that, you know, has some relationship to gravity and horizontality. And in most applications for this sort of exterior cladding system, you would want something where all of your standoffs either lined up with floor levels or went out horizontally from some other datum. And the controls that we've talked about both today and last time we actually talked about this stuff do not account for that sort of relationship that you want to create. What I want to show you now is something that's called Intersects, which allows you to sort of override this UV coordinate system that is dividing up this surface and use a different way of breaking up these surfaces. So I'm actually just going to delete this repeat just for the moment, just to get it out of the way. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a series of a series of planes that we're going to cut up our surface into that sort of conceptually can coincide with floor planes or some other rationale that you're going to use to cut up a surface. So if you select level 1, I'm going to just hit Control-Shift, and I'm going to copy them up. And I'm going to make, I don't know, 5 or 6 of these guys. Let's do something like that so that you've got something that covers most of your form or is slicing up most of your form. Right? And now if you select your curvy surface, you can see you've got U-grid, V-grid, and intersects. Now if you click off U or V, you're going to see immediately that, you know, half of your system disappears, right? We're going to click on U-grid so that we turn off the horizontal grid system, because the vertical grid system is just fine. We don't have any problem with that. But the horizontal grid system we want to override, and we want to use something else, right? So if you just have the V-grid showing, there's this thing, intersects now. If you use the drop-down, you can see that there's intersects from list and there's intersects. So if you go to intersects from list, we're going to do both, but let's start off with list. You can see you've got level 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up through 7. And I'm going to select 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just do half of your levels and say OK. And what you can see is that now my divided surface is being cut up horizontally, not by the UV coordinate system, but by the levels. I still have this thing selected, so I'm going to show you one other way that you can get references. So if you go to Intersects, just Intersects, not Intersects from list, it's going to put you into an editor. That is basically, it's a mode where you can pick things that you're going to want to cut up your surface with. And you can see that already I've got a handful of stuff that's highlighted. And that's because I picked it from the list. Now, if I hit Control, I'm going to be in an additive select. If I don't, if I click, I'll just lose all those things. But if I hold Control, I can now select all of those levels, and I can go Finish. And now I've diced up my surface according to level relationships rather than UV coordinates, right? So everybody should try and get to that point where they're like that. And then we're going to do it again for the vertical, for the flat face. And you don't have to do this right now, but I just want to sort of show you that, you know, each one of these levels, you know, if you move it around, it's going to move around the corresponding slice. So even though I just sort of slapped out all of these levels, that doesn't have to be where my divided surface ends up. Everything is still referring to everything else. So again, you don't have to do this, but I'm gonna quickly add parameters to these levels, or I'm gonna quickly add dimensions to them just so I can even them up. This is like extra credit if you're already sitting there with idle hands. I'm going to hit EQ so that they're all equal. And you can just sort of see that all of my levels just evened up, and all of my divided surface elements just evened up. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I've got my flat surface, and I'm going to turn off U-grids, and I'm going to pick my intersects, and I'm going to get them and finish. So now what we've got is we've got two different surfaces that are being sliced up using the same data. Basically what this means is that before, when we created a relationship between the interior and the exterior shell, we had this sort of weird splayed out relationship, which might be what you're going for, but most people are not going to be going for that sort of thing. You're going to want to have something that has an overriding system that determines how you want to have things connected, and you're going to want to override a UV coordinate system. So it looks fairly similar to what we had before. It is not quite the same. So if you go in now and you take your 4 points, your 4-point family, and I'm going to be looking at, the thing that's tricky on some of these things is that you need to sort of be looking at it just so you can figure out where you want to connect what to what. And I'm going to do that same sort of sewing operation where I say I want this cell to be connected to this cell. And then if you select your guy, you can repeat it again. And this time you have a sort of more tightly ordered relationship between your surfaces. So let's all get to the point where we have that. Does anybody not have what I'm showing on the screen yet? Yeah? Okay. Wait a minute till we get there.
I don't have it where they're all equal, like I have where I set them.
Yeah, they don't need to be equal. Don't worry about that. That's bonus. That's just sort of relying on a lot of sort of ability to add dimensions and add rationale to it that we had covered earlier.
Did you make the levels equal to each other, which affected the intersection?
Yeah. So sort of the parent-child relationship right now is getting a little bit more intense. So you have a divided surface over here, and you have a divided surface over here. The thing that they have in common is these levels. And this is where you start to see performance slow down. So if I select this level, and I'm going to just move it up a little bit like that, it's going to take a minute to refresh. Because now if I move one level, that moves all the other levels because they all need to be equal. And then when I move all those other levels, they need to move all of the divided surface slices. And then in turn, those divided surface slices need to regenerate all of the hosted components. And this brings us back to why we have a loaded mass in here in the first place. So if you want to go in here and you want to start sculpting and manipulating this surface, it's going to be kind of a hassle because now we started building up all these relationships and they're all going to update at the same time. So what we can do now, because we've sort of said, okay, I've got my building form and that's in one place, and all the components that are going to live on it are in another place. So if I Control-Tab back over to this guy, which is our base form model, I can manipulate this thing pretty freely. I can move it around. I can make some manipulation to it. I can say, I need this to be more wavy. If you select the points, you can pull these guys out so that they're a little curvy, whatever. And you can sort of work freely here. And then when you're ready to sort of say, yeah, this is about where I want to be, you can load it back into the project. And it's going to overwrite the existing version. And then now you can take the hit for performance for making that change. And it's just an ability to sort of both conceptually and actually separate out different systems that are happening in your project. This also means that because you're all in team projects, you can have one person who is working on the general form of your structure and one person is working on components of your structure. And you guys can both be working independently, but at some point focus your work together into one place and have it all regenerate and update. It's a way of just sort of being able to sort of divide and conquer. All right. So now we've got a loaded family, which is on top of divided surface, which is on top of another loaded family, right? And what I want to do is I want to start building up a slightly more complex set of relationships. So we're going to make a new adaptive component. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to make an 8-point component. And you can just sort of slap out 4 points first. So I'm going to say, I'm going to do a reference line. Make sure you've got 3D snapping on. And go 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm actually just going to make it a closed loop. Let's just do that. And if you're in Revit, it probably didn't fill it. It doesn't really matter. I'm actually going to delete that because I don't really need it.
I have a question, sorry to get stupid, but
Nope.
when you go new, it says project and family, no?
New project family.
So it's a project.
Yeah. New. Actually, family.
Right.
New project actually opens up an RVT file.
So where did you choose the adaptive component?
So if you go new family.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, this is a good point because you're working in Revit, right?
No, this is okay. See, no, sorry.
Okay, so you've got adaptive component. If you're working in Revit, actually this is a good point, we should cover this anyway. If you're working in Revit, when you do new family, you're going to see this dazzling array of colorful and beautiful family types, almost none of which we're going to use in this class. The adaptive component in Revit is generic model adaptive. And there's a bunch of different flavors of these things. There's your curtain panel pattern based, which we were talking about before, and the mass is kept up here in its own folder, conceptual mass, of which it is the only one in the subfolder. I apologize on behalf of my colleagues for that. Anyway, so we're back in here. We're in our adaptive component. We've made 4 points.
How did you delete the surface?
Let's see. So when I was like that?
I don't have the points on
Okay, good point. So the other gotcha, one of the many, is that when you hit reference line, you may or may not have 3D snapping checked. Must have 3D snapping checked. It really becomes it's so sneaky, but it's such a fundamentally different kind of beast when you're drawing with and without 3D snapping on. And I'm going to turn off make surface from closed loops because I just have no use for it. So you have this guy. We're going to do the same sort of song and dance that we did before, where we're going to make adaptive points. So here I'm just going to make sure that I only have my points selected. And I'm going to say make adaptive. Now what I want to do though is I'm essentially going to divide, we're going to be creating a sort of a cubic volume that is going to be connecting our interior and our exterior surface. So in order to make this cubic volume, you need to have 8 points to define all of the corner points of that cube. So I'm going to select all of this stuff, and I'm going to select my level, just because it makes it a little easier. And if you go over to the right on your view cube, you can just hit Control and drag it up, and ta-da, you're going to have 8 points now. And a lot of the stuff that I'm dealing with is just to sort of show, like, on the way, there's a lot of shortcuts. Like, rather than drawing 4 more points and selecting all your 4 points and making them adaptive, you can take your existing ones and you can copy them. There's a lot of different ways to end up at the same place. Some are more manual labor than others. So now we've got this we've got two frames. And if you select them both, you can select everything, or a lot of different ways to select it. We're going to just create a form. Now we've just got a cube, right? Now we're going to load this in, and we're going to place it again in our family in such a way that we can pattern it over both of the surfaces. And one thing that I want you to pay attention to is the order that these points occur. So I'm just going to look at this in wireframe. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's going to be important, because that is going to if you don't do it in the right order, you're going to end up twisting your form all over the place. So let's save this just so we have a decent name for it. And we're going to call this 8-point family. Sort of silly to put the name family in it because they're all families, but what do you want? And we're going to load this into host family. All right. So we've got this guy. He's there on our tooltip. And actually, I'm just gonna click once in the canvas, and then I'm gonna escape. And you can see that you've just got your guy there, because you don't actually need to place all of the points. It can remember how it was placed in the family, and it'll just do the rest of it. What I want to do is I want to make some room here for us to put this guy onto our surface. So if you select your repeat, we're just going to get rid of it. All right, so now we have the somewhat daunting task of putting 8 points from here onto here, right? And this is where it gets a little tricky, and you need to remember what order you place things in. So if you take your 8-point family that's over here in your project browser, I'm going to start on the outside, and I might get this wrong, but let's see. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and now I've got to go back down to this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so that's the first trial. This is for people to place that thing and see if they get it right. And I'll do it wrong a couple of times just to sort of see if I can get it to fail. So let's say I did 1, 2, 3, 4, and then rather than going here, which is where I'm supposed to, I go 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that's interesting. It's not really what I was starting off with, but what I've done is I've essentially introduced some twist into it, which is fun, and that'll work. But it's not what I was intending from the get-go. All right, so if you've got your nice extruded volumetric thing here, now you can do the same thing that we did before. You can select it and you can repeat. And like we were finding before with the divided surface, the sort of the seamless panel that we, through great trial and error and blood and sweat and tears, created last time, although it's just a cubic space, it's basically a playground for you to do anything else inside of that space. So, for instance, the Rolex guys. So, one of the things that's going on with your project is you've got this sort of repeated system that goes across the whole thing, right? And there are ways to conceive of it where you've got your top surface and your bottom surface, and you need to repeat some kind of column structure or beam structure in it. That would happen in a modular sort of cubic volume. This could be that framework for it. There's a bunch of different ways to sort of conceive of that thing, but one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting this together was that's one of the ways that you could think of that project. So we're going to do one more nesting operation because I want to show a little bit of the power of nesting. So let's go back into the family that's your 4-point family. Yo.
A question just about like general practices. Is separating the files like computational efficiency? And having individual files in your organization in like an isolated environment, is that just for computational reasons?
There's separating files out into different things. It definitely has efficiency in terms of performance. That is, you're working on one thing and you're not working on everything at once. There's actually sometimes there's some slowdown that you get from that as well. Without getting into the guts of how everything's put together, there's a little bit of overhead that you get for regenerating a loaded family as opposed to regenerating form that's right there in the project. But more, it's there's a conceptual sort of clarity that you can often get by saying this component is its own thing, and I'm going to deal with it in its own environment. Anytime that I'm going to have the same kind of shape occurring more than twice, I usually consider making it a loadable family rather than making it within the project itself. So we're doing a couple different things here by having loaded families. So here we've got a one-off shape of the exterior form of the building, and we're separating it out largely for performance reasons. That is, I can go and I can manipulate it somewhere else and then load it and then have all of the rest of the regeneration happen. There's also some clarity in saying, okay, this is going to be the form file, and somebody else on my team is going to be working on the form while I work on the components. So there's also the ability to sort of parcel out the work to different people. In full-blown Revit, there's a whole other world called work sharing, which is an ability to actually work collaboratively, which I'm not even going to get anywhere near in this. But just this is a way to sort of be able to work in multiple places at the same time. So there's a bunch of different reasons to do it. The other is that you can, when you have nested components, you can make them do very specific things. Like we did that deformation panel last time. That was, it did a very specific operation. And sometimes you need to swap out one very specific operator for another. So there's a bunch of different reasons to want to nest things like this. You can get different sort of superpowers from it, but it's also it can be just very a practical way to sort of avoid having to sort of watch things regenerate every time you touch anything. So we're going to open up this 4-point family, which we made before, and we're going to load this into a different place. We're going to take this and you're going to load it into, I don't care about saving it, we're going to load it into our 8-point family. So uncheck everything else. Now we're going to take our 4-point component and we're going to put it in our 8-point component.
Do I need to link them again to the lines?
They should already be.
I think we deleted it.
Oh, okay. You mean you've got like curvy things?
I just have the 4 points, but I don't.
Oh yeah, connect them up. So now I've got this guy on my tooltip here, right? And I'm in another adaptive component. Now I've also got some geometry in here. So I'm going to get rid of this geometry. Because what I want to do is I want to show a couple of other ways that you can repeat components in another environment, in a host environment, and also show you how you can start sort of building up complexity through nesting components in other components. So does everybody have their 4-point component loaded into their 8-point component?
So change reference line somewhere like that, correct? Change
Yeah, it's just so that you have something that when you draw it, it'll show up. So we were repeating these elements on a divided surface before, there's another sort of scaffolding that you can use to repeat these elements. And this is another tool that's going to be useful on a number of your projects as well. If you select all your reference lines here, you'll notice that there's a tool over here called Divide Path. So let's just hit that just to sort of see what it does. What you've got now is you've got each one of your lines has now been divided up. Oh wait, did that do it that way? Hold on a second. Hold on. 1 second while I see something. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize it was going to do it that way. Okay, don't select everything. Sorry. I would like for everybody to select individual lines, not the whole loops. So if you tab select and tab select, so you just have these 4 lines selected, and hit Divide Path. What you're going to do is you're going to get something that looks a lot like the divided surface, and that you get those little nodal points, but they're just on lines. And as you might expect at this point, these guys are going to behave very much like the divided surfaces, in that you can take your 4-point family, you can pull it off, and you can host it on those nodes, which I would like for you to do. So just pick one set of lines that vaguely line up with each other. Oops, and I missed one. If you miss one of these guys, you can also just select the point, and you can say pick new host and snap it to whatever it is that you actually want it to snap to. And you can tell whether or not you've actually got it snapped to those points by flexing your model. So here I can see that things are moving together as I want them to. So I'm just going to do the dragging the 4-point family out, and I'm going to do it where I'm placing it 1, 2, 3, 4. I think hotkey SX is snap to points. It just makes things a little bit cleaner sometimes to just make sure that you're snapping to the right thing. Also, your snaps button over here in the Manage tab will also allow you to sort of decide what it is that you want to snap to. If you're doing a lot of work with points and you know you're going to be spending a bunch of time doing that, you can just turn off all of your snaps except for SX, which is here, points. That means that you won't accidentally snap to this line or something else. Okay, now if you select this guy, you'll get the array tool. Wait, and before anybody hits it, what do people think is going to happen if you repeat this guy? Anybody? Free donuts for the first person who answers. You already clicked it. Do people think it's going to array nicely along the whole line? No? Okay, good, because it won't. So if you hit repeat, you're going to get this funny relationship. And with most of the stuff in this environment, when it does something that you didn't expect, usually it is because it is being rigorously and vigorously logical. So what you've done is, by connecting these points here, is you've got a line that is going in this direction, and you've got lines that are going in this direction. And essentially this is point 1, 2, 3, 4 on this curve, and this is point 1 on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you connected point 1 to point 5 and then repeated it. So how do you expose that and how do you understand that? If you select this line, you're going to see that there's a ton of other properties. Many of them are very much like the divided surface. But if you show node numbers, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over here. And if I select this guy and I say show node numbers, you can see that the numbers march in the opposite direction, right? So let's say that you want to take this guy and you want to array it along these edges so that they go in a nice orderly formation rather than sort of twisting on themselves. How do you do that? Well, you can select this guy, and there's also a flip direction, which will now make it so that this guy goes from 1 through 6 in this direction, and this guy goes from 1 to 6 in this direction. The other thing that you can do is you can actually tell the patterner more explicitly how you want this thing to pattern. So at this point, I've got these lines all screwed up. Like this one's going in one direction, this one's going in the other direction. Maybe I don't want to go in and get all the numbers to line up the same. Well, what I can do is I can actually teach the repeater how to repeat. So I can set one of these guys, and then I can set another one. And what I'm doing is I'm establishing a pattern, right? So now if I select two of them, and I hit repeat, they're actually going to do something more of what I anticipated. So I'm going to go back, we can try that again. There's like a whole 3-hour session I could do in repeating and patterning. But I don't think it makes sense to get into all of that. But the basic idea is that numbers of points are everything in this relationship. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all is good and happy in the world. And everything will line up. If it isn't, I'm going to need to add more information so it can pattern it. But the advantage of being able to add more information and for Revit to sort of start to interpret that is that you can do other patterns. You can start putting things out in checkerboard patterns, and it will interpret that into a checkerboard to spread over the whole thing. You can start making things where you've got overlapping patterns. I've got about 3 blog posts on the BuildZ blog that are just about repeat and different ways that you can use repeat. It's just sort of scratching the surface. A few of you have got heavy-duty repeat projects, and we can talk more about that in the next part of the class if you want to. But for now, why don't you go in and add one more layer of information to this thing so that you can get it to repeat like this. Actually, no, let's do something more fun. Sorry. I want you to select all of your repeats and figure, and how am I going to do this? Okay, I know. Get the remaining 2 sides, and we're going to divide those as well. So now you should have 6 divisions on each edge. And we're going to make a slightly more complex repeat. So once you've got 6 repeats on each edge, we're going to now teach the repeater how to do a more complicated set of relationships between these points. So if I'm gonna do this first, and then we can go through it slower. So I'm going to take my 4-point component, and I'm going to go 1, 2 on this set of lines, and then I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go 1, 2, like that. And as we saw before, this probably wouldn't be enough information to give this a sensible kind of repetition. So I'm going to try and teach it a little bit more. I'm going to say, I want to sort of start stepping this component around this corner, so that every time I have a component here, it's going to step itself around this side. And again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do this again. So now I've got 2 components. So I've taught this thing a little bit about how to repeat. And so now if I hit repeat, I can start getting this kind of cool relationship where you start, getting these bendy relationships. So let's try and make that. So does everybody have 6 repeats on each one of these lines? Yes? All right. So you're going to pick the first set in on one side and the first set in on another side, and then the second. And then repeat it. Whoa. I did something slightly different there, didn't I? Oh, whoops. The fun thing about the repeat tool is that one way or another it's going to make something, and it can surprise you. So I misplaced this 1 point. So if I go in here and I can tab select into that point, I can say pick new host, and I can correct what I did. So just because you missed something doesn't mean that you have to start over from scratch. You can correct. So are people getting a nice sort of slaying of lines? So now you're going to have a scribe from it. But now you should be good. You can actually select it. All right, we've got like 2 more little things to do, and then we can take a break and we can start talking about your projects. So if everybody has this, you can go ahead and you can load it into host family. And just do it into the host family, don't put it anywhere else. And so now what's going to happen is that cubic form that we had before is going to get overwritten by this new geometry that has the nested component in it. And you're going to get this other thing that says, overwrite the shared subcomponent family and its parameter values with the new version. And I'm going to go, yes, I want to overwrite as much as I can. And now this is where you're going to start seeing a lot of overhead and performance issues from having a lot more geometry and a lot more relationships to regenerate. And this is where you can start seeing the payoff for separating out the larger building form from the components. Because if you wanted to go in and manipulate that building envelope, it would be kind of a drag to have it regenerate every time, right? So does everybody have some sort of goofy pinhead geometry happening here?
I have a question. Can I have that? So how did you get to show to hide that?
Right, so that was the visibility graphics thing. So if you go to and you go to maps, you uncheck form. There you go. All right. One last thing, and then we're going to call it a day, or I'll call it a half a day. We're gonna make a manipulation now to that base 4-point component, and we're going to see how it can be updating directly into this project and sort of bypass the 8-point component. It's become a little bit more clear in just a second. So if we open up this guy, this is the 4-point component.
Did you just double click it?
Oh, I just hit edit, but you can double click it actually also and it'll open it. New to 2013. I'm going to take this chain of lines, and what I'm going to do is I want to start making this element a little bit more interesting or complicated, and then just allowing it to percolate into the rest of the system. So I'm going to turn this into a reference line, which is, if you select the model lines, it's a property that you can just turn them into reference lines. And this just means that rather than this line being the thing that I want to have show up, I want this line to be an armature for me to hang other geometry on. And we're just going to make a simple surface, which I'm going to tab select these two different reference lines. And if you just hit create form, oops, did I not hit create form? You get all these crazy options, but I just want to make a surface. So I've just turned my 4-point component, which has just so far been a line sketch, into a surface, right? So if you have that, and now you go load into project, but we're not going to load it into the 8-point family. We're going to load it directly into the host family. So remember, we had the host family had the 8-point component. And the 8-point component now contains the 4-point family. We're going to load the 4-point family directly into the host, and it's going to percolate down into the 8-point family. So if I go OK, it's going to say, there's a 4-point family already in this project. You're going to overwrite it. So say yes. And what should happen now is, for every one of those little instances, which is, what is it? We've got a 6x6 grid with 6 each. I can't do the math, but it's a lot of those components. It's going to percolate through all of them, and now it's going to replace them all with a surface. And so now you go from something that looks like all these weird pins to sort of a more fully formed relationship. And this is just to sort of show you how you can work up complexity in nested components to start to get a more resolved project, where you can go pretty quickly from something that just has sort of center lines for I-beams, say, to something that actually has a more sort of fully formed relationship. That's about as far as I wanted to take this particular thing today.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
So instead of snapping to the points, because you know it's so hard sometimes to see the point when you snap to, can you set up like a rule, like a coding rule or something to?
Can you set up a what rule?
Like when you place the component in the, say in the 8. Can you do it another way when you snap? I mean, it sounds like click point, but can you do it another way?
Well, you need to at least manually snap the points enough to establish a pattern.
Okay. You cannot type them either.
No, there's no. Well, yes, but it's a whole other scripting environment, which would involve a lot more clicks than just manually placing it. Are you saying you want to establish, connect point 1-1 with 0-1-? That's definitely a scripting environment kind of way to do it, and you certainly can. There are different access points, which you've messed around with that stuff, right? With through the API, yeah. But there's no UI for doing it that way. Yeah, the other thing that we haven't really talked about here is And I can just sort of show you a little bit about that here. I'm just back over on sort of a plain old surface. I'm going to turn on the nodes. Is you can define more complex patterns manually with that sort of rule teaching thing I was showing before. So here I've got 2 placed points that are creating a pattern. If I repeat that, it's going to interpret some way to repeat that same thing that I just showed. The other thing that is important about that is, again, the order in which I place those points. So I'm just going to do it where it looks like it's the same thing, but you're going to get a very different result. So here I placed 1, 2, 3, 4, and then here I did 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I repeat this, I'm going to get this kind of pattern where it spreads out. What it's doing is it's saying, okay, here I've got point 1 is going from here to here. And point 3 is actually staying exactly where it started. So there's different ways to sort of understand how to use the repeating tool for different both efficiency effects of just getting dumb work done that you want to get done, and also in exploring sort of more emergent patterns. More questions on what we covered today?
I just missed the whole last part of selecting the lines and making them assignment.
Okay. Here, let me just go back and I'll show that again.